Great.
Oh, now we've got to be careful.
With pleasure. Okay. Welcome, folks. We're going to be getting started in just a few minutes. As long as I am able to admit all the folks from the waiting room. Hopefully I'm doing that right. We'll try. Seeing. So far, so okay. We're going to get started shortly. Good evening, everyone. We're going to wait another minute or two, and then we're going to get started as people continue to come in from the waiting room. I will very much need to figure out how to turn off my notifications. Relatively complex. I think that takes care of that. We'll see. Okay. Okay, it is 8 o'clock and we have a wonderful representation on Zoom and in the room. My name is Dr. Shana Torpedo. I am a professor, assistant professor in the English department at Stern, and I am also a resident scholar with the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought. And I am delighted to be welcoming you to the last of our special series in relation to the upcoming presidential election, run with and by Dr. Tevi Troy. The last two sessions, if you've been here to join us, we had one with Dr. Sharon Potzer. Sorry, I'm also trying to admit admit people into the room and set this up, but one with Dr. Sharon Potzer from the Lieberman Center. Last week, we had a session with Dr. Tevi Troy and Erica Brown from the Sacks-Herenstein Center for Values and Leadership. And this week, I'm joined by two of my wonderful colleagues from the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought. And this three-part series has been co-sponsored by all three of those wonderful programs that run through Yeshiva University. What we've seen so far, the first session was looking at our public debates and policy among our leaders. Last week, Dr. Brown was in conversation with Dr. Troy about transfers of power, but this week we get to turn to the realm of the citizens and the rights and the freedoms that our leaders are protecting. And I'm really delighted that this last session is going to be with Rabbi Lerner. We know Dr. Tevi, who's been with us for the last few sessions, the former Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services, a best-selling presidential historian, drawing from extensive White House experience. He served in several high-level positions. He's currently with us at the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought as a senior scholar and impact officer and a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Rabbi Dov Lerner is a clinical assistant professor at the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought with responsibilities in teaching courses and mentoring students, conducting research. His courses are by far some of the most popular and hard to get into at the college. He received his BA in English Literature and Smicha from Yeshiva University, his MA in Religion and PhD in History of Judaism from the University of Chicago's Divinity School. And he's also a Lord Jonathan Sacks Scholar, and he serves as the rabbi of the Young Israel of Jamaica Estates community. Just a bit of housekeeping before we begin to avoid any unintentional or unwanted distractions. I'm going to make sure that everyone is muted, or I will do my best. Please, instead of unmuting yourself, we ask that you would put your questions in the chat, and we'll stop at about 8:45 to make sure that we have some question and we have time for those questions. Without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Rabbi Lerner and Dr. Choi. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Trapito, for that wonderful introduction and for coordinating this evening as well. It is a pleasure to be with you all this evening, and I'm so incredibly grateful for all of you taking time out of your precious evenings for this wonderful discussion. Dr. Troy, of course, has much to bring to the table, and I thought we'd dive right in. If we divide the next 45 minutes into two parts, maybe the first part more data-driven and then the second part more ideas-driven, I thought maybe we could have a productive conversation, firstly, that turns on your wheelhouse, and then somewhere where we could have a conversation that's a little broader in scope. So I guess if our topic this evening is there a religious way to vote? We can talk about the ideas related to that. How should religious people vote? Should religious people vote? Etc. But have a look first at how religious people have voted. And I thought maybe you could share some of what you know about Jewish voting patterns in the United States over the last, how long we got records for.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Tribito, for the introduction. And don't hate to put my thumb on the scale, but this is my favorite of the sessions because it's all Strauss scholars. Dr. Tribito is the introducer. You and I are the conversants. So go Strauss. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with Rabbi Lerner, especially because Rabbi Lerner is a pulpit rabbi. And a lot of my thoughts on this subject have to do with how we in the religious leadership, or how our religious leadership should deal with questions about politics when they come up during this obviously very fraught political season. But I think Rabbi Lerner was correct to talk about what the voting patterns are. And look, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone on this call that the Jewish community has generally voted Democratic for the last 60 plus years. I say 60 plus years because there was initially a tradition that Jews were Republican. There were more Jews in the northern states than the southern states back in the Civil War era, although there were some prominent Jewish Southerners. And the Republicans were seen as the anti-slavery party and the party of the Union. And so Jews were prominent there. And then the German Jewish community tended to be more Jewish. But once the big Russian immigration came, the Jewish community has been largely Democratic. There was when Franklin Roosevelt was president, there was a strong affiliation or a sense of association. And I even heard this crazy story that at bar mitzvahs in New York in the 1930s, and you would have the bar mitzvah boy would walk holding the Torah, and then behind him would be the rabbi, behind him would be the chazan, and then after him would be a placard with somebody holding up a Roosevelt sign. So that was the extent of the Roosevelt adoration in the Jewish community. And then in the last 60 years, when I think we have the best records for, it's really been a safe bet that the Jewish community is going to vote somewhere around 70% for the Democrats, 30% for the Republicans. But there's some variation in there. I call it a 28-point swing from from when.
We experienced some election interference.
Just a touch of Wi-Fi disturbance, I think. I'm sure we'll catch up with us in just a second.
Okay, well, when Dr. Troy gets back, I'll ask him to pontificate on whether it is habit that you can have a safe bet that Jews are going to vote in this way, if there are particular issue sets that seem to drive the community. But I guess I'll rely on him. What are your views, Dr. Trapito?
No, not fair. I'm here for guidance from you. All right, he's
Right.
back with us. He's kind of rejoining, I hope, in a second. He'll be coming in.
Okay.
I'm
Well,
happy to talk about 16th century English politics.
that's a
There
good
was
idea.
no voting, so
Sorry
I'm
about that.
not free.
I guess what I can throw out, oh, Dr. Troy is back.
Okay.
Wonderful. I don't know how much of what you said we missed, but probably the last 35 seconds.
Well, I did get my good Roosevelt story with carrying the placard because I knew because you laughed about that. But
Yes, correct. By the way, what was the adoration related to? Was it a policy issue? Was it to do with the Second World War?
This actually predated the World War, um, but and some would argue, like my friend Ravi Medoff would say that if they actually knew what Roosevelt was doing in the World War with relation to the Holocaust, they wouldn't have been such Roosevelt fans. But Roosevelt was just very good at building coalitions, and he had a very strange coalition that included uh, Southern whites, but also a lot of the black vote, inner city unions, Jews, ethnics. I mean, he was able to bring together a lot of disparate coalitions that didn't always necessarily seem like they would go together. But uh, but really, in the period since, let's say, Kennedy, it's been a safe bet that the Jews are going to vote 70% or so Democratic, 30% or so Republican, but there's some variation in that. And what I've noticed is there's a 28-point swing. So 11 points is the low. George H.W. Bush got only 11% of the Republican vote, and the high was Ronald Reagan in 1984, who got 39%. So that 28-point swing, I call that the koach, the kind of using the old Jewish tradition of numerology, uh, and that shows the power of the Jewish vote because when you have only 11% of the Jews voting for you as a Republican, it's very hard to win. It doesn't mean the Jewish vote is determinative, but it's a bellwether. But if the Democrats uh, do so poorly that the Republicans are getting 39% of the Jewish vote, that's a really bad sign for them. So
Who
that's
got
the
39?
local variation. Ronald Reagan got 39% of the
Right.
Jewish vote,
I
which is
mean,
pretty high.
that's
Yeah.
a huge swing.
Yeah, and it's interesting that those 2 years don't come that far apart because Bush in 1992, when he got the 11%, he seemed to go pretty hard after Israel, or actually, it seemed hard at the time. I guess we've had politicians be harder on Israel subsequently, but and he had his Secretary of State made that infamous comment that was leaked to the press, as James Baker said, "F the Jews, they don't vote for us anyway." And then also he kind of went after AIPAC and all their lobbying for Israel support for loan guarantees to help during the Soviet immigration, the immigration of Soviet Jews to Israel. And he kind of said, I'm just one lonely guy up here against all these lobbyists. And he was, effectively might have been saying these Jew lobbyists, but he just said these lobbyists. And so he really got hit pretty hard. And Bill Clinton ran as a very pro-Israel Democrat in 1992. So again, there's that variation. But the other thing to know about this is that, and I was a former White House Jewish liaison among my other sins that Shana didn't get to talk about. So I was involved in the 2004 campaign. I went to work. I left the White House to work in the campaign and was involved in the efforts to reach out to the Jewish community. And Al Gore did very well with the Jews in 2000. And you have to remember, Joe Lieberman was his vice presidential pick, the only Jew on a presidential ticket up to this point, and also an Orthodox, highly identified Jew. And obviously, we miss him and lament his passing. But so Al Gore did very, very well. Something like 80% of the Jews voted for Gore in 2000, and Bush only got about 19%. So it was a pretty bad showing for a Republican that year. And the our efforts in 2004 were about changing that. But we knew we weren't going to you're never going to get, if you're a Republican, 50% of the Jewish vote. We weren't looking at that. We were looking to change the Orthodox vote. And the Orthodox vote went something like 65-35 for Gore in 2000. And with
65 toward Gore.
towards Gore. So Gore, the Democrat, got a majority of the Orthodox vote in 2000. But in 2004, when Kerry was the nominee, and this is after 9/11, remember, the Islamist terrorist attacks against America, and then also the Second Intifada, where Bush was very supportive of Israel. In fact, there was an instance where Ari Fleischer, his Jewish press secretary, was asked what to do about Israeli retaliation to all the horrific terror bombings. And the language that Fleischer had gotten from the State Department was, "We call on all sides for restraint," which is typical, mealy-mouthed State Department nonsense. And Bush hears this from Fleischer, and he says, "No, don't say that. Say Israel has a right to defend itself." And Bush strongly supported Israel and its right to defend itself in that Second Intifada. So he got enormous credit, maybe not across the Jewish community, but within the Orthodox world. And he, in that 2004 election, which was also a close election, he won 70% of the Orthodox vote. Now, he still lost the Jewish vote, but not as badly. It was something like 75-25. So Kerry gets 75% of the Jewish vote, Bush gets 25%. But there were big swings in favor of Bush in key counties like Cuyahoga County in Ohio, which is where Cleveland is, and it's also where the Telz Yeshiva is. And the Telz Yeshiva Rebbeim put out the word that we're all voting for Bush. And that helped. And without Ohio, Bush doesn't win that race. And then also Florida, without which Bush doesn't win that race. We saw a big surge for Orthodox votes for Bush in Dade County, which is Miami, where there's a heavy Jewish population. So if you are a Jewish campaign operative, Democrat or Republican, you don't really care about the places where the most Jews are, namely Illinois, New York, California, Maryland, Massachusetts. Those states don't matter at all because those states are going to vote for the Democrat no matter what. If all the Jews show up, if all the Jews don't show up, those are very heavily blue states. But you do care about Florida, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona. These are
Pennsylvania.
states, Pennsylvania, obviously, yeah. These are states where the Jewish population may not be as high. It's maybe 1 to 2%, but these are close states. These are purple states. They can go either way. And also the Jewish share of the electorate is usually larger than their percentage of the population because Jews voted very high numbers. So we had a rule of thumb that if Jews were 2% of the population of a state, the Jewish vote might be as high as 4% in that state because Jews all show up to vote. So to make swings in those states is very important. So again, in summary, the Jewish vote largely votes Democratic. The Orthodox vote has been shifting, and I would say has now shifted into the Republican column. Orthodox Jews are only about 10% of the overall Jewish population, but they are also growing as a percentage because they marry earlier, have more kids, tend to marry Jewish. And so the Orthodox population, for example, in New York, well, one of the recent Pew surveys said that while only 10% of the overall Jewish population in America is Orthodox, 27% of Jews under 18 in New York City are Orthodox.
Wow.
So the Orthodox are growing, and I think they will make the conversation about where the Jewish vote is get more interesting in the years ahead. But right now, it's a safe bet that Harris is probably going to get around 70%, and Trump's going to get around 30%.
Interesting. And is it your sense that this kind of safe bet voting pattern is based on habit and family tradition, and this is the way Jews have always voted, at least in the areas of the Jewish community that are going to go Democrat traditionally, or is there an issue set that divides the 70-30?
Yeah, I don't know if it's habit per se, but I think you could say that Jews are tend to be urban, highly educated, um, and these things correspond to Democratic voters these days. Jews outside the Orthodox community tend to marry late, also corresponds to Democratic voting. And I actually saw one analysis this year. I'm not sure I'm on board with this, but that said that since Jews only vote 70% for the Democratic ticket, and Jews tend to be urban, ethnic, highly educated, and marry late. Those people you might think might be 85% for the Democrats. So maybe the Jews vote a little less than you would think for the Democrat. I'm not sure I buy that analysis, but it's worth thinking about.
That's very interesting. I mean, I grew up in Britain, which is obviously a different electorate, a different political system, and a different national history. But there is a similar trend that I seem to have at least been told about from my parents and their peers, is that you go back 40 years, the overwhelming majority of the Jewish community would vote for the Labour Party, the equivalent of the Democrat, kind of leaning to the left of politics. And you don't have the same breakup denominationally in Britain you do here. So you might say, you know, here it kind of divides along denomination where the Orthodox vote is divided from the Reform vote or the Conservative. But in Britain, the Reform community is a slight minority. And the Orthodox kind of denomination is overwhelming in its proportion. And they were still voting left. And I've noticed this pivot over time. People who were kind of hardcore, as I was growing up, I remember being hardcore Labour voters. There's been a shift in the community. And of course, some of you may remember Jeremy Corbyn was the Labour leading candidate a few years back, which caused quite a stir in the Jewish community. But even before him, I noticed there was a pivot Is it your sense that foreign policy issues have become more front and center for voters in a kind of more globalized age, and people used to vote on domestic issues more, and that's become more prevalent now, or is that not the case at all?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, I do think there's a big difference in Britain. First of all, they have less of a denominational split. And also, Jeremy Corbyn was an out-and-out anti-Semite, and I don't think there was much dispute about that issue. And
I mean,
we,
he
thank God,
disputed it, but other than that,
but I don't think we've ever had an out-and-out anti-Semite as a major party nominee in the last 80 to 100 years. Uh, so it's just in some ways a different situation. But you're right, the patterns are that the Orthodox Jews are becoming more conservative politically. Uh, I do think that domestic issues tend to predominate among all voters, not just Jews, just all Americans. But this year, after the horrors of October 7th, I think a lot of Jews are looking to the Israel issue. I think they weren't happy with how the left reacted. And when I say the left, I mean the left on campuses and the left in kind of the intellectual world. The Democratic Party, if you look by vote in Congress, they still tend to be largely pro-Israel. We've got the squad members who are terrible on Israel, but on votes to support funding for Israel, it's still largely pro-Israel from both the Democrats and the Republicans. Republicans more overwhelmingly. But there are cracks on the Democratic side that are worrisome. On the Republican side, there's very few things that unite Republicans these days. One thing that does is Israel. They're all pro-Israel, almost all. On the Democratic side, the Israel issue is increasingly an issue of division. And this you can see in the voting patterns. The If you ask Republican voters, do you support Israel? They usually say about 80%, yes, I support Israel. Democrats are under 50%. And so that means if you are a Republican running for office and you're speaking to your core constituents in a rally and you say, I stand with Israel, you know you're going to get cheers. If you are a Democrat and you're standing with your core constituents, you say, I stand for Israel, you're not necessarily sure what the reaction of the crowd is going to be. So that also causes them to moderate their tone, even if they are pro-Israel.
right, it was a fascinating turn of events, thinking of the tragedies from Israel as it kind of coincides with this discussion about a month ago when it was a Democratic National Convention and Rachel and Jonathan Golbo Poland was speaking to the convention, the palpable shock she had and kind of broke down, and afterwards was asked, she said, we were expecting a neutral to negative reaction, and it was kind of overwhelming that the room erupted in cheers of support. And I don't think they were alone in being surprised by that reaction.
Yeah, I was surprised.
Say again?
I was definitely surprised.
Yeah, and I think that probably offered a measure of comfort, at least for, a flicker of time to the Jewish community, that it's not, as you say, it's not a guarantee that you've got an anti-Israel party and a pro-Israel party, but there's one that has more kind of ambiguity sewn into it that is worrisome, but not Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah. Let me also say why I was surprised, because in 2012, there was a vote on the floor of the Democratic Convention to recognize Israel's capital as Jerusalem. Now, obviously, we now know, post-Trump, the capital is Jerusalem, but at the time, it was a matter of dispute. The U.S. Embassy was in Tel Aviv, and they put it up to a voice vote because they had forgotten to put it in the platform, and they were getting some criticism for it. So they put it up for a platform, and the mayor of Los Angeles kind of gavelled it in and said, all in favor say aye, expecting everyone to say aye. And if you listen, it's clear they didn't all say aye. There was a mix, a big mix in rooms. So he called it again, and it was still a mix. And then eventually he just gavelled it down and said the motion is passed by voice vote, but it clearly had not. And then he got booed heavily for doing that. And I don't know if the booing was because they were some people were anti-Israel, or because they didn't like the procedural shenanigans. But it definitely made a lot of people take notice.
Wow. Okay, well, thank you for spending some time with me talking about kind of the data of Jewish voting patterns. And I know it can, in some ways, put our backs up a little bit. It is contentious. It is anxiety-inducing. And we are, of course, 5 weeks, 6 weeks away from an election where the question of the Jewish vote has played a role in news cycles, talking about a potential vice presidential candidate who maybe was looked over for his identity. And I'll also note, having grown up in Britain, it could be I was particularly sheltered. I don't think I was. Just the way elections are reported is very different. In America, breaking down identity blocks for voting is kind of par for the course. You talk about the black vote and the Jewish vote and the Orthodox vote. In Britain, it was kind of anathema. You would never mention breakdown in identity in that way. I mean, even to say a racial identity out loud in conversation was kind of a faux pas. And the idea that someone would say, we want to get the Jewish vote, you'd almost be alienated on the spot. Of course, America has a big influence in that shifting, but I don't remember that kind of speak. So it's always anxiety inducing to me anyway. So let's pivot away from the data and kind of the immediacy of this election and talk about ideas of how a religious person ought to think about voting. And now you noted a few minutes ago that Jews vote in large numbers. What do you think drives that? Is that an ethical drive? Is that a panic on the part of Jews who want to assert some control over their lives in a kind of unpredictable world? What is your read on that?
Yeah, I don't know if it's panic, but I do think it's an interest in asserting control, an interest in social policy just in general. This whole sense of tikkun olam is a driving force, especially within the reform movement. There's just a sense that we want to have a say. Also, Israel, I think, drives a lot of people to the polls, especially in the Orthodox world, but it used to be more across the board. And this was a time when, there was a time in the 60s and 70s when the Democrats were seen as the more pro-Israel party, and to vote Democrat was seen as the pro-Israel step. That the streams kind of crossed in the 90s, where I would say there was a moment in the 90s where both parties were kind of equally pro-Israel, and then the Republicans have become kind of more unanimously pro-Israel, and the Democrats have more splits on it, as we talked about earlier. So I think those are all parts of the conversation.
That's fascinating. I see a couple of questions are coming in on the side. I don't know if we want to take them as they come now, or we'll kind of turn to them toward the end. There's some interesting provocative thoughts. I guess if we think about what motivates a religious person to vote, one thing that struck me as I was exploring this a few years ago, there's a rather well-known responsa that was penned by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. It was in the 80s on the subject of voting. And he kind of implores the Jewish community to vote. And he does so on the basis that we should be grateful. He grew up in authoritarian Russia, had to flee, and suggests that the United States, with quite accuracy, has been the most supportive non-Jewish state to Jews in human history. And we ought to, just out of gratitude alone, to vote. And I always found that kind of a mixed message, because on the one hand, it does inspire a level of awe in the sense of gratitude, but it's almost like we're doing a favor to the government by voting for them or whoever we're voting for. And I've always thought that voting should be inspired as a religious person, not out of gratitude to an authority, but out of a religious responsibility to be civically driven and engaged. And that might be a generational divide over time. But I think, as you point to, the value of being a civic-minded citizen seems to be also quite a heavy push for Jews to be engaged. And I guess we can turn to the question of what your view of pulpit rabbi speaking politics is. And I'll take notes so I can figure out what to say.
I'm going to answer this question, but I really want to hear your answer to this question as well. I'm involved in a series of debates. I've been going across the country for the last year with Rabbi David Saperstein. He is a prominent Reform rabbi. He's been head of the RAC, the Religious Action Center, which is the Reform movement's political arm. And he is adamant that rabbis should be involved in politics. They should tell the people how to vote. And that, there's this joke that the Reform movement is, going to shul into the Reform movement is like going to a meeting of the Democratic National Committee, except they have pews. So, and there is a very strong association within the Reform movement of voting Democratic. That's seen as part of their raison d'etre. That doesn't mean every single Reform person is Democratic, but if you're out and out Republican in a Reform synagogue, it can actually be uncomfortable to some degree. I had a woman who was Reform, and she wanted to give her kid a bar mitzvah, but she was also a staunch Republican. And she went to the rabbi and said, well, we're big Republicans. And he said, I'm not sure you'd be comfortable doing a bar mitzvah here. So, that strikes me as odd and bizarre. Now, I did grow up in a conservative synagogue where it seemed that that rabbi and pretty much every rabbi in the conservative world took their cues for their sermons from the New York Times editorial page, which is not the kind of drashes that I get today when I go to an Orthodox shul. My current Orthodox shul, which is the Kent Mill Synagogue in Kent Mill, Maryland, has a lot of politically involved people, and there is a very, very strict rule: no politics from the pulpit. We might have in a separate room, like the social hall or something, on not during davening time, a conversation about the election or a briefing from Israel. But from the pulpit, we don't talk about politics. And I happen to think that's a good rule, and I think that's the right approach. But when I talk about this with Rabbi Saperstein, he's adamant the other way. He says the Torah is a political document. Tzedek, tzedek, terdov, justice, justice shalt thou pursue. Shouldn't we advocate that our people vote in ways that pursue justice? The Torah talks about charity. Shouldn't we be voting in ways that that promote government charitable efforts, or transfer programs? So as much as I push on the issue, he is adamant the other way. And I've noticed most of these debates have been in Reform synagogues, that I don't get a lot of positive response from the audience. And there are plenty of issues where I do get positive response, and I probe and push on those issues. But on this issue, it seems like they don't mind the politics, and he certainly wants to keep it as part of the tradition. So I think that's just very different from what I'm used to in my current Orthodox synagogue.
I mean, it's very interesting. In the trenches, so to speak, on the other side, I certainly sympathize with your sentiments that politics don't belong in the pulpit, with a kind of caveat. And to some degree, there's a pragmatic concern, which I guess the first pragmatic point is my position as a rabbi means I have to be there pastorally for everybody in the pews. So I need to be present if somebody is burying a family member, and I don't want them at any point to feel like, oi, why'd I have this guy, this putz who's going to be here to help me through this life crisis. So I need to insulate myself from alienation just as part of my job so that I can be an effective pastor. So that's a pragmatic concern. But aside from that, when I was trying out for the shul I'm currently in, one of the questions, they had a Saturday night evening gathering where everybody came, and I was peppered with questions. You might even see it as a presidential debate of sorts. Although the first lady was next to me, I had my wife next to me, I got some questions too.
More like a press conference.
Yes, exactly. More like a press conference. And, one of the questions was, what is your view of politics from the pulpit? And my instinct on this is, at some level, obviously politics has to come in to the pulpit. As the most extreme example, the Nazi Party were a political party. And obviously to have a view on that from the pulpit makes sense. Not that I need to stand up and tell Jews don't vote for Nazis, but it's reasonable to refer to that and have a position on that in public. But my general rule of thumb, some have said you can be political at the pulpit, but don't be partisan at the pulpit. I'm not sure that's the way I would divide it, but if there's ever a political divide, that I think a good faith argument can be made to support that view, and there are rational people in the room who may take it, I'm not going to weigh in, because everyone's entitled to their reading of the issues. And if there is a good faith argument to be made, why should I trample on their good faith reasoning and assume mine is superior? And I know some rabbis disagree and think you're paid to be a superior, moral voice on this. But I think if there's, a good faith argument to be made, and there's a lot of pressure, I should say, this means I have to do a lot of work trying to get into their heads of, the spectrum. So is there a good faith argument to be made for voting Democrat? Is there a good faith argument to be made for voting Republican? If there is, I'm not going to weigh in. If I don't think, and I've done, my research on this matter, that there is a good faith argument, then I'm going to, you know, assume it's reasonable for me to take a view and defend it if someone comes to me. But on the whole, to the response from Rabbi Sacks-Herenstein that the Torah is a political document, I would agree, again, with a caveat, that it is infused with political values, but it is very sparing on policy. And that means from the pulpit, I'm very happy to speak about political issues when it comes to moral values, whether it means about being civically engaged, being inclusive, caring for the poor. But I think a good faith Republican would say, I care very much about the poor, and this is economic policies that will work. And a Democrat would say, I care very much about the poor, and these are the policies. So I don't need to get in the policy discussion if I can shape the psyche of the congregation that helping the poor is important. And then I'll leave them to decide, you know, which policies. I'm not an economist, and the Torah doesn't pretend to be either. As Dr. Trapito mentioned, I'm officially a Sacks scholar, so I should drop his name at some point. He makes this point again and again. He's wrote essays on Jewish economic policy and a huge amount about politics. And at no point does he engage in policy. And he says repeatedly, even on the question of governance systems, monarchy, democracy, autocracy, theocracy, the Torah doesn't really prescribe these views. It describes a monarchy with all sorts of checks and balances that imply a lot of hesitation about its dangers. And it doesn't prescribe how government should work or economy should work, but what the values that kind of churn these systems are. So I think Rabbi Sacks-Herenstein is right. In a fundamental sense, it's a political document. Joshua Berman wrote a book about how the Bible is a break with ancient political thought. It's hard to escape how political it is, as opposed to the New Testament as an example, which is not. But that doesn't mean it's a policy prescription document that I can assign to a party. So, you know, on questions of immigration, that's a very hot issue right now. Helping the poor isn't really a central tension in the electorate at the moment, but questions of immigration policy is. So does this mean I'm not going to talk about immigration? No, but it does mean I'm not going to say you should support this party platform or that party platform. I'm going to talk about our view of the immigrant. And to be clear, I can see a good faith argument being made, even though Mr. Trump has the reputation of being an anti-immigrant figure who spends a lot of time ratcheting up rhetoric about the wall and people eating cats and dogs and whatever else. He in the past has said, I love immigrants and I want to build a wall with a big, beautiful door so they can come in legally and help, whatever the case is. So a good faith argument can be made, even if you're not a fan of the rhetoric, that I am a committed pro-immigrant figure as a descendant of immigrants, so I'm going to vote Republican. So if a good faith argument can be made, I'm not going to get involved in the policy dispute, but I will try to foreground the value, even if I feel like, or maybe especially if I feel like it's ebbing in the psyche, I'll try to kind of foreground that without showing my cards on what I think the best policy prescription is, because I know I'm not an expert and I shouldn't pretend to be. So that's kind of my 2 cents on
A couple of
that.
thoughts on that.
Say
So
again?
first of all, so Rabbi Sacks-Herenstein, in responding to me, he basically says, I mean, without being so crass, he basically says I'm a hypocrite. He says, you'd be fine if the rabbi talked about a policy you agreed with. You just don't want the rabbi to talk about, you know, liberal policies you disagree with. And I don't think that's true. I really don't want any politics from the Bema. But you know, maybe there you could see a point where, let's say, if the rabbi says stand with Israel, you know, I'm obviously for that. Do I think a rabbi should say that from the pulpit? I mean, our rabbi did say pro-Israel things, I guess, after October 7th, and I didn't have a problem with that. So, you know, it gets, there are gray areas. The other thing is I'm a firm believer in the timelessness of religion and of the Torah. The commentary article I sent you in advance of this is I don't like when our religion gets mixed up with short-term political considerations because these things change. If you were a Democrat in 1850, you were for slavery. If you were a Democrat in 1950, you were for segregation. If you're a Democrat in 2025, you believe totally different things. These things change over time. And the religion is not supposed to change, or at least not as much. I mean, there's obviously change in the religion, but it's a much slower pace. And I like the timelessness of the religion. I like the fact that the davening I do is the same davening, and I could have gone to a shul in, I don't know, the 15th century and understood the service. And I don't want it to change that fast, because there is a, there's a timelessness to it. And I just don't like politics invading what I think is sacred space. I'll tell a story. My mom passed away in 2020. We had the Shiva at our house, and this one person came to the Shiva, and he just started talking about Trump and how great Trump was, and just, I don't care whether it was pro-Trump. I just didn't like all that stuff. But he was going on, and there were people getting really uncomfortable. And there was this woman in the back of the room. I still don't know who she is. I didn't know who she was then at the time. And she said, while this guy's ranting at me, he said, "Tell us something about your mother." And she completely diffused the situation. And I got to talk about my mother, and that ended it. I'm still grateful to that woman. I don't know who she is. I think she's maybe a female version of Eliyahu Hanavi, but I don't like the politics in the sacred space, and I don't want the sacred space to go into the politics. So that's just how I view it. And maybe I'm idiosyncratic, because it's a political season. Everybody wants to talk about politics all the time.
Yeah, I don't think you're idiosyncratic. That's my sense as well. And I think there's a lot to be said for, I mean, one of the gifts of Shabbat that is always foregrounded, whether it's by Jonathan Haidt or other people in the space about how damaging technology has been, is that it is a refuge from the pace and the weight and the pain of everyday life. And politics has been so interwoven, almost that it's become a sport now, that you have a team and you side for them, and everybody who disagrees with you is an enemy or an idiot. And it
Or both.
or both. Although that's the best kind of enemy. If you're going to have an enemy, they should be an idiot. So there is something to be said for shul to be not out of reverence for the building, but out of reverence for your soul, to be a place of refuge where I can come and I can hear, like you say, a timeless message. And I know when I'm looking through, sermon manuals as a matter of historical interest or looking for inspiration, I can almost tell in the first paragraph, this is going to be useless to me because it's a reference to some policy debate in the 1970s. Or is there something that's got a timeless seed that I can draw on and apply to my context? So it does give it more shelf life, and not in a way that kind of thins out the substance, but actually it kind of deepens it in some sense. And what I found helpful for me, because of course you are going to have people like Rabbi Saperstein in shul who say, but I want to hear what the rabbi says about this issue, and it's a live issue. And while religion is a refuge, I don't want to live in a cave. What happens here should infuse public life. I've kind of settled on a compromise, which is the drasha or the sermon I insulate from anything overtly political. I'll speak about morals that are pertinent, but not about anything that's clearly easily tied to the moment. But there is a moment right before we do the Tefillah L'Medina, we do the prayer for the state of Israel, and we do the prayer for the United States. If there is something that is bubbling up in the national psyche, or there is like a contentious issue, or there's a rally, I will find a way to mention it then, also without weighing in where I think there's good faith room for ambiguity, but I'll say something about what's happened in Israel this week, or where our minds are. If there's a rally, or we've got an event coming up, a speaker, I'll mention it there, and I'll say, now please join with me for the prayer. Firstly, it's more effective because people are, in a drasha, people can fall asleep. During the prayer for the Medina, no one's asleep, and they're on their feet, so they can't fall asleep and they're paying attention.
I've heard you speak. There's no way people are falling asleep.
I have evidence to the contrary. But it's so I found that to be a useful pivot, and then it kind of diffuses the aggravation people would have. Why doesn't my rabbi have a view on the politics? Like, I said something there, and then now you can sleep during the drasha. You don't have to worry about it. And it does it kind of relieves it from having too much tension. So I don't know if that's useful to anybody listening or thinking about these issues, but that I found helpful for me. But I see we're kind of heading in the last few minutes. So I
Yeah, I
guess,
saw there were a bunch of questions. Should we try and do a
yeah,
lightning
we
round?
can turn to the questions. Dr. Trapito, do you want to sift them, or we should do that?
I would leave that to your discretion. The lightning round idea sounded fascinating. Some of them are all on a consistent point, but see how many you can get through. That would be lovely.
Can you tell us what the consistent point is?
Sure. A lot. The last few have been related to the idea of voting based on a candidate's character, and can you separate character from policy? Maybe you can speak on to that point.
Dr.
Me
Troy,
first?
you want to weigh in on the question of character?
Look, I'm old. I remember in the 1990s when they were talking about Bill Clinton and his his deviances, I guess, and people talked to us about character. And then many of the same people who are criticizing Clinton today are fine with Trump, and he's obviously had his moral lapses. So I tend to feel that people use the character issue to justify the person they want on the policy basis. That doesn't mean they should or they shouldn't, but I think if you're okay with someone's policies, you'll overlook their character flaws. And if you are not okay with their policies, you'll say, oh, I can't vote for them. He's a character. How dare you vote for this person of a character with which I disagree? So I just feel like that's how people rationalize.
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, from the perspective, of my rabbinic background, there's a huge weight in rabbinic tradition on people in public leadership on having good character. Of course, that's up for debate. What does good character mean? And it strikes me, I was listening to an interview that Tony Blair, some of you may be familiar with, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, for 10 years or so during the Bush years, Bush Junior years, who just released a new book last week or something about leadership. And his view, whether one likes his policies or not, was that essentially there are three phases when you become a leader. The first phase, because you've come into the job, you don't know what you're doing, you're listening to everybody, but you're kind of overwhelmed. And then eventually you find your feet and you think you don't need to listen anymore. And that's the second phase, when you listen to nobody. And then the third phase is when you realize how to kind of siphon out the important things and you start to listen again and you realize what you don't know. He says that the trouble with this breakdown is that usually you only reach the third phase about a week before you finish your term and you never get to be the good leader. But it strikes me, if you want to talk about character, some people may find it off-putting if a political figure uses foul language. They might say that's a character flaw. Of course, I remember somebody mentioning this once in 2016, when Mr. Trump was first running for office. Someone said he uses very vulgar language, and someone said, I don't know if you've heard the tapes of Nixon, and I don't know if you've heard, the reports of JFK. They use foul language all the time. They just didn't have Facebook and Twitter to let the whole population know about it. So to some degree, we're more exposed now. So we have a nostalgia looking back. But I'm not sure foul language would sway me one way or other. I think there is a central character question, and it's not about, is this someone I would have at my Shabbos table? It's about, is this a dependable leader? Are they willing to listen? Do they have a recognition of their limits? And are they dependable? And they can partially, you could talk about fidelity to their family and say that gives me a barometer on how they care about loyalty and commitment and devotion and their dependability. But it wouldn't be they've had, family issues and therefore they don't qualify. It's just, are they going to be a dependable leader? As often has been said in defense of people who aren't seen as pristine characters, you're not voting for the head of the church, you're voting for the president of the United States. You want someone who can be efficient. But of course, I don't think efficiency is the sole measure of public leadership. You want someone who is trustworthy. There is since we're talking about the rabbinic side on this, and by we, I mean I brought it up, right toward the end of the book of Numbers, the two final Parshiot, Matot Maseh, the opening to Matot is Moses standing and they're on the cusp of the Jordan River, about to go into the land of Israel. And it is the only time of all the commandments that he addresses singularly the leaders, l'roshei hamatot, to the heads of the tribes. Every other mitzvah is addressed either to the Kohanim, who it applies to them specifically, the priests, or it's to the people. And there's one law, he speaks only to the heads of the tribes, and it's about vows, about whether you can annul vows and how you keep them, etc., etc. And there's a whole question among the commentators why he addresses it specifically to the leaders. The most famous commentator, Rashi, suggests it was essentially out of honor. It was kavod to let them teach it to the people. Nachmanides has an intriguing observation that some things shouldn't be trusted to the masses. And if you told the masses all the loopholes in the tax code, you wouldn't make any revenue. So you're not going to tell the masses about how to cancel vows. But an 18th century rabbinic figure known as the Chatam Sofer or Rabbi Moses Schreiber essentially says when you're in public service, there is nothing more important than your trust. People have to trust you. And Moses is saying to the people on the cusp of entering into the land, when you make a vow, you have to keep it. And of course, it's now a phrase to talk about campaign promises. That someone's on the stump and they make a promise. Nobody really expects it to happen. And that's kind of a corrosion of the civic bonds that keep leaders in line and keep us engaged, because we become cynical. So I'd say character matters, but that doesn't have to be read as, they speak nicely and they wear a nice tie, but they are dependable and they recognize their limits. But that also obviously has gray area. And unfortunately in politics, it's a binary choice. So it's not like you can pick, the chief rabbi or, the Pope, whatever your preference is. You get two characters and you just got to pick. So I don't have a good answer to whether character should dominate, but I think it should matter in a serious way. Thoughts, reflections, any other questions?
Well, yeah, let's see if there's any more questions, because I think we're almost at time, right, Dr. Tribito?
Right. Somebody did ask a technical question about whether it's prohibited to give endorsements from the pulpit. And as far as I know, the answer to that is yes. That you
Yeah,
can't
technically it is, but you see all kinds of they'll have Sunday conversations if it's not from the pulpit, or a lot of these synagogues or churches have voter drives where they'll drive you to the polls or make sure you all vote early, and it's a very clear feeling of where people vote. There's that piece I shared with you that I wrote in the Wall Street Journal about 10 years ago. It's called the White House's Advice for Your Rabbi. The White House had a meeting before Rosh Hashanah in the Obama administration with a bunch of rabbis on the phone. And I, for my sins, was privileged, I guess, to be on the call. And I was shocked at how political it was and how they were telling the rabbis you should talk about the Affordable Care Act and how important it is to pass the Affordable Care Act from the pulpit. And I guess that doesn't violate the Johnson Amendment because it's not explicitly saying go out and vote Democratic, but it's basically saying we support these Democratic policies.
Yeah. So I try to avoid endorsing, and by avoid, I mean I never do. But I think what we all tend to do is we tell people to vote. Say, whoever you vote for, vote. And, sometimes, they know you mean, I know who you're going to vote for, but you should vote anyway. Because when political parties see that Jewish voters are engaged and they do turn out, they're obviously going to think about what matters to the community. There was a question somebody asked about the importance of the abortion issue when Jews vote, which to me sounds like a question about whether we should vote our moral values or vote our interests to some degree, without getting into the thicket of pro-choice or pro-life. I guess that's a question generally I wonder about. If you think of questions like the veil of ignorance, and I was going into a voting booth and am I voting for what do I think the ideal society's policy should be, or am I voting what's best for me? And I mean, you worked for a campaign. What do politicians assume? Are people voting their interests or their values?
Interest, I think. And I
Right.
think they want people to, I mean, what's the key question in every debate that starts from Ronald Reagan in 1980, which is, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? That's basically how people vote. And politicians want, if you're the incumbent, you want to say, look, you're better off than you were 4 years ago because of me. And if you're the challenger, you want to say, look, things are much worse because of this guy, vote for me instead. So yeah, I think interests.
Yeah, interesting. Right. So I see there's some active responses. Yeah. I'd say if we're coming back to character again, I can't weigh in on the figures who are standing for office in particular, but I agree it's a complicated question, and we were using hypotheticals. Yeah, I mean, the question of values versus interest it's interesting to me, I would say, at least from personal experience. I don't know if this is overly confessional, but I went through a very self-aware market shift when I became a homeowner in my attitude to voting. In that, as a college student, I had very little stakes in the economy. I paid taxes if I made bits of money here and there. But on the whole, you could think, what is my ideal society? And who's going to represent that writ large? And then you become a homeowner, by which I mean you become a debt owner. And it becomes the stakes of the status quo being kept, or the cost of all these things become far more foregrounded in my mind when I'm voting. I got to think about, and if I'm, a student and I'm drifting around, the quality of the neighborhoods doesn't matter to me because I'll find a neighbor. But if I'm now rooted, I'm going to start voting in a way that kind of supports my interests more than my values to some degree. And I just noticed that shift. And I'm not sure I was entirely comfortable with that shift. But it does seem to be reasonable.
Well, I mean, we definitely see that in voting patterns. If you are a single female in this country, you're much more likely to vote Democrat. And if you're a married female in this country, you're much more likely to vote Republican. They talk about the gender gap, that women are more likely to vote Democrat than men, but it's really a marriage gap. So the more like you, the more likely, if you were married, you're much more likely to vote Republican. And if you're single, you're much more likely to vote Democrat.
Interesting.
And it's
And
especially the case with women.
what's the reason?
Well, I think it's kind of the things you were talking about. You're rooted, you have a home. A lot of younger students you mentioned vote overwhelmingly Democratic because uh, maybe they have ideas that they're getting from their professors, or more idealistic. There's different ways you can look at it, but definitely as your status in life changes, your voting patterns tend to change.
Yeah, yeah. So that's interesting. Okay, any other questions? Come on in. Should we ask people if they want to verbally ask a question?
Well, I just want to answer one question, and I think we're over time, but some and I'm not great at reading the questions because my eyesight's not great, but I did see one that come in that said, if Harris is elected, will Israel be lost, as Trump claims? And I really did not like Trump's answer about that at the debate. Look, Israel, I've been to Israel 4 times since October 7th. And I hear this over and over again. People say, there's 9 million of us. We're not going anywhere. We're not leaving. Now, maybe you'll kill some of us like they horribly did on October 7th, or maybe you'll make it uncomfortable, or maybe we'll, constantly have these terror attacks or problems, but we're not going anywhere. So I don't think the US president by themselves determines whether Israel exists or doesn't exist. I mean, the closest that ever came was with Harry Truman when he had to make the decision to recognize Israel. But Israel's not going away, and at least I sure hope not. But the American political decisions don't necessarily determine that. Although there can be candidates who are better for Israel and worse for Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole tenor of campaigning has been kind of ginned up to such a level that it feels apocalyptic, that it feels like if your preferred candidate loses, like the world is over. And as a rabbi in 2020, I had a lot of this from congregants who, in that gap between election day and inauguration day, as the general society was getting far more tense, I was getting a lot of people who coming to me as, you're the rabbi, you need to say something about it, you need to address this on all sides. And I think the sense that it isn't apocalyptic, that you may have a favored choice, but on the whole, these are shades of gray with some real significant gaps. But every 4 years, we as a country get to redress it. Every 2 years, we get to put a check on whoever's in power if we so choose. And there are limits to what any president can do. They don't have the power of the purse. There are all sorts of ways in which the founders established this country so that it's not cataclysmic every time. And I think we're experiencing an appeal for attention and care. And of course, if everybody calms down, the people don't vote. because they think, oh, it'll be fine. So it's in the interest of politicians for us to be ginned up to the point where it feels cataclysmic until the point where they lose, or the other side wins, and then it explodes.
Yeah,
So
I
I think,
totally agree with that. I've been involved in politics most of my adult life. In every single election, we've been told this is the most important election of our lifetimes. And
yeah,
then people will
yeah.
inevitably say to me, but this one really is. You know, the most important election, and as far as I'm concerned, was the election of 1800 when when you had Adams was the sitting vice president or the sitting president, and he loses to Jefferson, and he voluntarily leaves office. It's the first time somebody voluntarily left office after losing an election. I mean, Washington never lost an election, so he just left after 8 years. But Adams loses, and he was a bit of a bad sport about it. He didn't go to the inauguration, but he didn't take the army. He didn't fight. He didn't say, I'm not leaving. He just went back to Massachusetts, and he had a peaceful transfer of power. And that was the most important election of anybody's lifetime. And, that's the kind of system we're in. And I think we should appreciate it and have gratitude for our system.
Yeah, it's a remarkable thing. And to some degree that kind of brought that back to the question of character. With so much resting on that, Adam's decision, rooted presumably in his character. I saw the PBS series that was masterfully acted. I have no idea how accurate it was historically. But in that way, at least, character matters. So thank you for your time, for your insight, for your guidance. Thank you, Dr. Trappido, for your coordination. Thank you all who are on for your attention. I'll hand over if Dr. Trappido is going to wrap this up for us.
Not much to add to that. Very, very lively, engaging conversation. I guess I'll just end by touching back to the last note that Dr. Troy mentioned with the appreciation and the gratitude. Thank you so much for both of you, and everyone should enjoy a calm, collected season from now until the election and then beyond. Thank you so much, both of you. Have a very good evening, everyone. Be well.
Thank you. Good night.